Kia ora tāte te whānau, e hari te rangatira, he Māori ai, engari e hari te rangatira. Tērā pia ko te tuatahi, he honore, he krore ki te atua, he mai ngā rongo ki te whenua, he whakaaro pai ki ngā tāngata katoa. Hanga e te atua, he ngā kauhau, ki roto ki tēnā o mātou. Whakatongia tō wairua tapu, hei āwhina, hei tohitui a mātou. Hei huihuinga tangata nā reira, tēnei te mihi atu kia tātou. Ki tōku whanaunga, kua haere ke ia, engari mihi atu kia te hira, nāna i whakapuare o tātou hui i tēnei ata, no reira mihi atu. Ngā mihi hoki ki te mana whenua o tēnei o tātou rohe, kia rātou māno Ngāti whātua, tēnei te mihi. Ngā mana ki tanga hoki, ki oku whanaunga, no Ngāti Rahiri, no Ngāti Kawa, ki Hokianga, ki Waitangi, Aroha mai ki Waitangi. I te kāna hoki ki te mihi atu kia kaurua ko Tom Rāua, ko Sam, tēnei te mihi atu kia kaurua ngā kai whakahaero tēnei huihuinga. Kia tātou katoa, ngā iti me ngā rahi, kua taimai tēnei wā, tēnei te mihi atu kia tātou. Ai, he uri no te hapu o Ngai Tuteauru, no te iwi o Nga Puhi, ko Puhanga Tohora te maunga tapu, ko Mangatawa me Otaua ngā awa e rere iho nei, ko Pukerata te marae e tika ai, ko Rahiri te matua tupuna o ngā mea katoa no Nga Puhi, no reira tēnei te mihi atu kia tātou. Ko te aroha rā kia koutou ko mahue nei te ao Rountree tōku ingoa, he uri a hau no te pito o te ao i roto i tāku nei reo. The centre of the universe is the place that I come from, Hokianga. So kia ora tātou. So yes, I do a little bit of teaching around here. I feel like I've infiltrated another mihi-nare space. I'm wetiri ana, and I work for Trinity College, so the Methodist College, and we share a space here. We share teaching space and also office space. I always say to my mihi-nare whānau, we're your pohara cousins that borrow your space, but ngā mihi kia tātou. Ngā mihi hoki ki ngā kai kōrero i tēnei wā, a tāhuara wātu, te wero hoki, kia tātou i tēnei wā. So I'm supposed to be talking about Reconciling Te Tiriti, and I said to Tom when he asked me, I was actually in Germany at the World Council of Churches, pretending to be busy, but I managed to jack something up. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some perspectives around, I guess, Māori identity, theology, and how that has kind of interacted or has some interplay with Te Tiriti. So, Reconciling Te Tiriti, the title and focus of this wānanga, presents us with an opportunity, a chance to bring together different perspectives and to reframe the contested treaty, so we're told. I bring a Māori perspective of reconciling Te Tiriti. That can be distinguished by a process of hohau rongo, of seeking to restore balance, to work towards healing a frayed relationship, and to commit to peace. So as Mead suggests, in situations of conflict, rongo is restored when the parties involved agree to commit to an enduring peace. An essential part of the process of hohau i te rongo is the recognition of hara, or wrongdoing, and the relinquishing of any ill will. Sometimes easier said than done, particularly for my whānau from the north. The reconciling of Te Tiriti requires a willingness to restore balance, to rebuild trust, and to advocate for redress. For those of us from mainline churches and theological institutions, this means recognising and reconciling our whakapapa that is entangled and interwoven into the colonisation of tangata whenua in Aotearoa and in Christendom. This paper begins a kōrero, a talanoa, a dialogue about the reconciliation of Māori identity, theology, as it is pertaining to Te Tiriti. So it might be a little bit outside of what was written in the abstract whānau, but just go with it. So, reconciling Māori identity. As tangata whenua, we are inextricably linked to the whenua, like a metaphorical umbilical cord between a mother and her child that binds one to the other. According to Māori cosmology and creation narratives, Papa Tuanuku is our ukaipo, mother and source of sustenance. She is the embodiment of the earth, of the land, and the source of life within the natural world. Māori tradition maintains that humanity is interconnected and interrelated through whakapapa to and with creation and the divine. Our identity is moulded and shaped by our whakapapa. Our identity is profoundly bound to and with the whenua. Our identity is guided by the depth and breadth of our tikanga, or customary belief and practice. Our identity is informed by intergenerational collective mātauranga, or knowledge and knowledge systems. But what happens when that connection is interrupted or corrupted? Paul has already talked a little bit about colonisation and talked a little bit about British colonial annexation. And here, that annexation of tangata whenua and Aotearoa has interrupted the physical and spiritual interconnectedness of our people to and with creation and the divine. As Jury explains, the impact of colonisation on Māori has been the loss of culture, land, population, and autonomy. And my brother at the back there spoke about that this morning as well. We as tangata whenua became a tiriti people out of necessity, out of survival, as we heard from Mamari. Survival is often that motivator for Māori. But we also became a tiriti people out of a commitment to a covenantal relationship. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later on. So Māori identity is forever changed and changing because of Te Tiriti. Reconciling our identity with our colonial past and present, and as an unequal partner in a bicultural nation, casts an uneasy shadow across our often weather-worn faces and our whenua. We have lost much, and we have gained little in the way of well-being. Jury concedes that, as is the case with Indigenous peoples around the world, Māori lag behind the non-Indigenous population on almost every measure of well-being. Reconciling our identity, encompassed in Te Tiriti, is vital to the well-being of our people. We as tangata whenua are a relational people. We thrive on the hononga, or what we call the connections, those particularly whakapapa connections. We thrive on those hononga that we make and that we maintain. Te Tiriti as a covenant brings a spirituality to the agreement. And I think there was an agreement, by the way. The question was asked earlier. So Te Tiriti as a covenant brings a spirituality to the agreement our peoples, Māori and Pākehā, entered into time and time again. So this wasn't just one event. It's this ongoing consideration to still be in relation with one another. Māori have continually sought out a relationship. We have been in pursuit of a relationship of mutuality and respect. For those of us who are Māori and Christian, we have inevitably, geez, my English is not too flash today, look to theology and theological reflection to help guide our way. So this piece here is entitled Patchwork Papatuanuku, and it explores public theology for the uncommon good, the uncommon, unfamiliar, undocumented theological contributions of native people, with a focus on our Aotearoa Tangata Whenua context. The uncommon and unpopular perspectives of Tangata Whenua are really part of a public theological dialogue. Public theology is often idealised as being for the common good. And theologians, aroha mai whānau if you're a theologian, often seek justice that is perceived to be common and good for all. But for those of us who are marginalised and pushed to the fringes of the public sphere, this piece explores the questions: does public theology really serve us? Does it bring about justice for native peoples? Reconciling theology. I recently travelled to Kirikiri in Northland to attend the annual conference of Te Hāhi Wetiri Anō Aotearoa, the Methodist Church of New Zealand, where we celebrated our bicentenary, 200 years of Methodism in Aotearoa. And I just want to share a few things with you. This is an opening reflection from the Covenant service given by our president, and it reads, this is our president, the Pākehā whalo on this side, Peter Taylor, and his vice, Tirito Peru. So it reads, in this our bicentennial year, we have looked back on the history and traditions of Te Hāhi Wetiri Ana o Aotearoa. Here in the far north of this land, we have traced our starting points and places where the covenant, Te Treaty of Waitangi, was first signed. So as a tradition, as a kōrero, as an ongoing journey, Te Hāhi Wetiri Ana has always considered Te Treaty of Waitangi to be a covenant, and therefore that early relationship to be a covenantal relationship. And in the prayers of praise and confession, a reference to the treaty as covenant. We thank God that Māori and Pākehā chose to work together in a treaty, a covenant for this land of Aotearoa. So Te Hāhi Wetiri Ana is constantly engaging in this conversation around theology, faith, and te tiriti. For 200 years, the Methodist movement in Aotearoa has grown in our understanding of te tiriti. And we have struggled at times with the living out of our covenantal relationship. The Methodist Church as an institution has had to reconcile our covenantal relationship repeatedly with each generation. Our conference in 1983 established what is referred to as our bicultural journey, an intentional commitment to power sharing and consensus decision making. As a conference, we continued to explore and renew our covenantal relationship imbued in our bicultural church and in our bicultural partnership practice. The Methodist Church developed many resources to assist our people in the introduction of the bicultural journey, and often they were designed to bring about kōrero, conversation, dialogue. This particular resource was produced in 1992, so it's kind of old school, but it talks about doing theology in our bicultural journey. So it wasn't enough to have this bicultural commitment, but we had to be able to resource our people. And this is from way back in 1992. And so there have been resources since. But I wanted to read some of the statements that are reflected in this particular piece from 1992. So the first statement reflects the responsibilities of the covenantal people, or us as covenantal people. And it says, Te Tiriti of Waitangi was a covenant made between two peoples in the presence of God. In the presence of God. So this tells us a little something. It's a little something more than a piece of paper, a little something more that we are committing to. So in the understanding of Māori and the missionaries that were there at the time anyway. Therefore, the people of God surely have a responsibility to ensure the agreement is honoured. The second statement I share is taken from the Bicultural Committee report from 1987 and addresses identifiable Pākehā privilege and dominance in the church. It states, deep down we, Pākehā within the church, still hold images of, for example, white purity, the result of being cleansed from sin. In many ways, Christian theology continues to feed our dominant attitudes, our Pākehā monoculturalism. So even in 1992, they were identifying these key issues around how we communicate different ideologies with one another. The last statement is from the same Bicultural Committee report, but from a year later, 1988, and it reads, the treaty establishes the basic relationship between Māori and Pākehā and must be responded to in terms of the way power is exercised. The use of Pākehā power to dishonour the treaty over the years shows the impact of racism in Aotearoa. The treaty is also part of the Methodist heritage, as Wesleyan missionaries were deeply involved in decisions about the treaty, in its preparation and in persuading Māori to sign. Te hāhi wetiri ana o Aotearoa, the Methodist Church, therefore regards Te Tiriti o Waitangi as a foundational document which we must seek to honour, and in that honouring, seek to redress the injustices of the years, or over the years, sorry. So these statements are a culmination of a church and a theology emerging from our Aotearoa context and saturated in the reconciling of faith, of theology, of church and society. These statements are reflective of a time of change and upheaval for the pursuit of hohoi te rongo, reconciliation and restoration. I whakahuatia e nōpera panakarea ōna whakaaro ki tēnei kōrero. Ko te atarau o te whenua I riro I a te kuini. Ko te tinana o te whenua I waiho ki ngā Māori. So these are the expressions of nōpera panakarea. The shadow of the land will go to the queen, but the substance of the land will remain with us. These sentiments attributed to nōpera panakarea of te pātū, te raroa. He was a rangatira, an evangelist, and signatory to both He Wakaputanga o te rangatiratanga o Niu Tireni, 1835, and Te Treaty of Waitangi, 1840. Panakarea, like many rangatira of the time, was confident in his identity. I tōna ke rangatiratanga me tōna mana motu hake, in his principal authority and independence and his ability to exercise autonomy. His relationship with the CMS missionaries, William Williams and W.G. Paki, began in 1832 with a visit to Te Kaka, Kaitaia. By 1834, he had freed up land for a mission to Kaitaia and facilitated the building of a road and the first homes for the mission station. It could be said that this early relationship was the beginning of a reciprocity of finance and faith. By late 1836, both Panakareao and his wife were baptised. A year later, he had acquired a copy of the New Testament in Māori and had begun to spread the gospel in surrounding Papakainga. Having developed good working relationships with the CMS missionaries and having developed his own evangelical approach, Panakareao, it is presumed, had a measure of trust and security in the missionaries and in their theological teachings. By the time of Te Tiriti, Panakareao likely had a degree of trust in the likes of Busby, who had developed the declaration with Māori in 1835, and also potentially with Hobson, who had the support of the trusted CMS and Wesleyan missionaries of Waitangi and also Mangungu. The supposition that Te Tiriti was a covenant between Māori and Pākehā was built on the premise of this covenantal relationship. And these conversations had come to light in discussions, particularly with John Hobbs. I know no one has really talked about the early history of the signing at Mangungu mission, so the second signing. So after our whānau gathered in Waitangi on the 6th of February, most of them left to go home. Mai tupuna, Nene and Patuone left Waitangi having signed Te Tiriti. They went home to parts of Hokianga, and along the way they talked to everybody, as we do when we go home. We stop in and we visit our whānau. So we talk to them about what we've just been doing. And this is the premise of what was happening for our people. So travelling from Waitangi back to Hokianga, those conversations continued. And even at Mangungu, John Hobbs talked a little bit about this whole idea of kawenata, or a covenant, and what that meant, and what it gave to this particular agreement. So you can see the sort of sense that this is something tapu. If the missionaries are talking about it as a covenant, like the covenant you have with God, it's something more. It's something more spiritual, and perhaps more tapu in our own context. By April of 1840, Panakareao and his wife had signed, and it appeared that Te Tiriti had been solidified, at least for them. Panakareao likely signed with certainty that his interests and those of his people would be protected. So there's conversations that have gone on before the 6th of February, and all of those conversations and kōrero get transferred as people travel to these other places of signing, which makes sense if you think about the numbers at Mangungu in particular. But it's really the relationships that I would indicate for us to highlight and to keep in our minds, those early relationships between Māori and missionaries. Those are what really sold, I think, and got the buy-in from a lot of those rangatira, particularly those from Hokianga. Mai tupuna travelled from inland, a little place called Otaua, to Mangungu to sign the treaty on the 12th of February. So we have these different connections of whakapapa that are drawn on to bring people together, to come to join this particular covenantal relationship. Not just a document, but a relationship. Ko tahi tau I muri mai, ka hurihia pēnei hia e ia tana kōrero. Ko te tinana o te whenua kei te kuini. Ko te atarau anake I mahue nei ki te Māori. So just a year on, and Panakareao is now saying the Queen has the substance of the land and the Māori retains only the shadow. Just a year on. So this paper has begun as a little investigation into this reconciling of Tangata Whenua identity, theology, and te tiriti from a humble Māori, not clergy, not theologian perspective. As the descendants of the signatories to both He Wakaputanga and Te Tiriti, we are drawn into the shadow of the land that once was our ukaipo. As the inheritors of Christianity in Aotearoa, and as the remnants of missionary forebears who exercised influence in the developing of a covenantal relationship, we are obligated to seek justice and reconciliation. This paper takes some unsteady steps along the cobbled road to reconciliation and the exercising of justice as a prerequisite to unity. Nō reira e hoa mā tēnā rā koutou katoa.